Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Measure Sustainability Fast. I hope so. This will give you some insights and examples of how we proceeded at HOBUM over the past few months. And so let's have a look why this is relevant at first. If you have been checking the news for the past few years, actually, you would have noticed that there was one record after the other, and not only on a local base, but also on a global base. So we had extremely hot summers in Germany for the past 4 to 5 years, and also in other parts of the world, there had been records in terms of climate change. So this should be clear already that we have to do something, and some might say this is just one little occasion, and we also have other events that counterbalance the heat, for example. And that's pretty true because in 2021 we had a flood in Germany, which was very bad, very tremendous. So we had on the one side far too few water, and on the other side far too much water. But this is just emotional and not any values or figures. And we like to work with exact values and figures. So I had been looking at economic statistics or economic studies because I wanted to know, is climate change expensive to us? This is where businesses, we want to have economic growth. So I was looking at different studies from a big Swiss insurance company, Swiss Re, and they mentioned they had started a study with 48 countries that make up over 90% of the world economy. And they say that the climate change will cost these 48 countries about 10% of total economic value. And they had a great online tool, great map where you can see how big the impact of climate change is on a certain country. So they calculated a total climate change index with different aspects of on the economy. And I don't know if you can see it, but quite in the center, there's Germany, and it's with the total index, it's green. So some might say, okay, why are you caring at all? Because climate change doesn't seem to affect you or will affect you economically. But then if you change the index to the wet climate risk, as they say, which we have seen before, Germany is quite red. Not dark red, not too bad, but we will see impacts. So then I was looking at, okay, how expensive will it be to adapt to climate change? And there's a McKinsey study, and they say that we can save, the chemicals and agriculture industry can save up to 45% of emissions without having any extra cost, which is great because this is almost aligned with the Green Deal and the German climate strategy to reduce the emissions. It will not be expensive at all. And then there was even, because sometimes for me, it's not enough to just have one study or one opinion. So I looked for another one from the consultancy BCG, and they stated that Germany could even achieve 95% of emissions reduction without harming any growth of the economy. So I think it's very feasible, and that should be reason enough for each of us to start acting now, because no action is not an option, actually. So what did we find out over the past few months of work and research internally? We have looked at corporate level emissions and product level emissions. So basically, if you take an average over the past, or if you calculate out the effects, for example, of the pandemic, then we have about 2,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalents in emissions per year. CO2 equivalence means that sometimes you have emissions like methane or other chemical substances that also have effects on the atmosphere, that could be even higher than CO2. And to have a comparable result, you calculate the equivalence that equal the effect that a substance would have if it was CO2, or like compared to CO2. when we then break down our overall emissions onto the products, then we have about 0.2 kilogram of CO2 emissions per kilogram of product. But I have to mention these two values and calculations are only based on scope 1 and 2 emissions. That means direct emissions from gas that we had been burning or process heat that we have been using, and electricity, for example, that we get from the grid. So you might say this is not too bad, or this is quite high, or I don't have any clue how to compare this number. There's another scope from when you're following the GHG protocol, which is the scope 3, and this is all the emissions that you buy, so to say. So if you have the raw materials, they come with an emission label already to your facility, and then you process them and you add up on these emissions. And we try to look at the biggest emissions that we buy or that we get externally in our scope 3, so to say. And there we have about 33,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. So factor 13, 14 higher than what we add onto those products. What is our strategy? So here at HOBUM, we have on one hand, resilient and on the other hand, also adaptive strategy. So we focus on local production and partnerships, which is very important, and you will see shortly why. And then, as Elizabeth has presented in the first talk today, we have the RTRS and NEO products, which bring great reduction and thus great value to our customers. And also, we have taken some resources for sustainability because it's just not negotiable to not act. This has led us to a silver rating by EcoVadis, which means that we are under the top 11% of all companies that had been rated by EcoVadis for 2023. For now, the rating for the 2024 period is still going. So unfortunately, I could not bring you the results. And when we look to the future, as Mr. Miguel has said in the introduction, so we have now calculated the product carbon footprints. In 2027, we will switch to green hydrogen, which will reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions enormously. And then this will help us achieving our reduction goals for 2030 by 42% for scope 1 and 2. So now I want to show you how did we get there and what are the main takeaways for you and main gains of this procedure. Not only will you have the results in the end, but you will have a strong database for process and efficiency optimization. You will be able to benchmark with your competitors and prove to your customers that you have an advantage if they take your products. And of course, you're contributing to fighting climate change. And this is a strong purpose because for example, I have hopefully a couple more years on this planet, and I would like to not suffer from heat strokes or swimming to my home in the summer. And also the future generations will thank you. To give you a perspective on the emissions, the corporate emissions, I looked at the German chemical industry. They publish the data for each year. The 2023 data is not available yet because, as you can think, the chemical and pharmaceutical industry is quite big and it takes a little time, a little later than March, to collect all this data. So for 2022, the chemical industry had 39.6 billion kilogram of CO2 emissions, of CO2 equivalents, and the turnover was 261 billion euros. I was thinking that the turnover is quite a good comparative factor in this case, because usually when you're looking at economics, for example, at country or state economics, you're also looking at the GDP, the gross domestic product. So it's better, to have the economic value in this factor as well. And if you divide them, you will get 0.152 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram product, per euro turnover, sorry. And now I was wondering, okay, how is HOBUM doing? Because we are part of the German industry and we're a small or medium-sized company. So I would have expected that maybe we don't have some efficiency advantages that big companies have. But it turned out we're quite good. So we have 0.074 kilograms of CO2 emissions per euro turnover. And this means we are 2 times as effective as the German chemical industry average, which is nice or funny and good in my opinion. So how did we get there? Step 1, first you have to identify all relevant activities, scope 1, 2, and 3. So let's look at the scopes a little more in detail. Scope 1 means direct emissions. So that's relatively easy by looking at your fuel bills, technical reports from your machines, for example, or certifications, and asking your production or engineering lead. And scope 1 means direct emissions, so all emissions from burning or from creating CO2, so to say, in your facility. And I brought you some questions you might ask. So for example, your production lead, how much gas, fuel, and oil do we burn, or maybe also in your controlling? What is the petrol consumption of our corporate fleet? So if you have cars for your employees, it's very important to look at cars that you own, because leased vehicles are actually scope 3. But this is really in detail and we want to measure sustainability fast. So how much leakage occurs in our pipe system? If you have old pipes and your, I don't know, like carbon, hydrogen compounds are leaking into the atmosphere, this could be quite harmful. And do we have open system processes, including volatile compounds? This is another question that contributes to scope 1. Then let's look at scope 2. This means indirect emissions from grid-bound energy, which could be the electricity, of course, but also process heat, or even if you have cooling systems on a grid that transfer your heat to the outside of your facility. The approach is very similar to scope 1, but I also brought you some questions. So, for example, how much electricity, process heat, remote heating or cooling do we use? This is again for your production lead or for your controlling. Who's my external contact point to find out about the origin of electricity and heat? Because sometimes, especially when you are working in a Verbund, for example, with different companies, it's not that clear whether your electricity has the same emission factor as your overall, let's say, the German grid. So if your neighboring company is producing electricity, then it might be good to check in on how they are actually, or how efficient they're actually working. And this could also lower your emissions in scope 2. Then let's have a look at scope 3. This means any other indirect emissions caused directly or indirectly by your company. I have to say good luck, because scope 1 and 2, they have between 4 to 5 subcategories, so to say. Scope 3, if you're following the GHG protocol, has 15 subcategories, and this could be anything from cleaning services to leased vehicles to transportation to financial assets. So it's a very broad scope. But I brought you some questions to narrow down what your effects or what your effects are in scope 3. What is the carbon footprint of the material or services you're supplying to us? This is definitely a question you want to ask your supplier. Why did our CEO fly 60 times to the US instead of video calling this year? It feels silly to me, but you really should reconsider if a visit is necessary, especially if it's an intercontinental trip, because as we know, these trips, they cause emissions, and like today we're streaming online, it's quite feasible to do so even for business meetings. And last but not least, who invested our free capital in Gazprom or Aramco? This is not an exclusive list, but these are some examples of very emission-intensive companies. And if you have shares or any other financial products in these, you would technically have to report in your scope 3. So what's the second step? This is just the scope definition. The second step is your documentation system. I would think about this early on, because if you have a future-proof system, then the system can grow with your company. So At some point, you will have historical data. You want to see how you improved in comparison to the previous year or to 10 years before, especially when it comes to target definition. You want to see, okay, where's our baseline to what we want to reduce our emissions. Then, of course, updating and archiving data. So at some point, maybe your business model will change, and you will you will have new scope categories that you have to input in your system. And of course, the access to data. So how many people are working with your system, with the data collection, for example, and also data ownership. So who's responsible for this data collection and the documentation system. If you have figured out this, you could be doing this with Excel, but there are also standalone software and cloud solutions. I don't want to name any specific here. And also there are ERP, so for your electronic resource planning system, integrated modules that you can use, which can facilitate and future-proof your documentation system in terms of emissions and sustainability. Step 3 would then be the data collection. So as I like to call it, the big hunt, because now you know what you're doing and where to look. But to get the actual data, to get accurate data, to have a quality system which says this value is almost like as true as possible, so to say. But this is also highly dependent on step 2, on what kind of documentation system you've chosen. And regardless of your system, it will be very crucial to engage colleagues at all levels. So communication is definitely key at this step, but also at the steps before, as you have noticed probably. And then if you have very complicated situations, there's support from ISO standards, for example, and private sector guidelines. For example, the Together for Sustainability initiative, they have a guideline which covers lots of aspects, also for complicated situations like outsourcing different or certain services. And then there's an extra step, because now as you have done all this research and system implementation, it could be nice to actually define some targets or determine some targets. And you can, of course, follow the Paris Agreement from 2015, which we will not be reaching anymore, since last year was the average was 1.5 degrees above. But also there's the Green Deal from the European Commission, and there's also some private sector initiatives like science-based targets. So let's have a look at the product level. These are the results for the product carbon footprint of our merchant art ESPO, which you have also already seen in Elizabeth's presentation if you joined this morning. The standard ESPO lies about 5 kilograms per kilogram product, and the Neo ESPO is about 0.75 kilograms per kilogram product. And the Neo option is European-based soybean oil. So just with changing the main raw material, of course, we can reduce 85% of our emissions. And this is quite immense, because if you're looking, if you're remembering on the first slides that we had 12 to 13 times more scope 3 emissions than scope 1 and 2 emissions, this has a big leverage effect if you reduce your scope 3 emissions with products like this. How did we get there again? This is a very quick guide, and it's a huge topic. But first steps is framework and modeling. So again, define your scope and boundaries. Then you have to determine your primary and secondary processes. And after you set your basic framework, you can look at modeling according to your production protocols, because your people know a lot about how your products are made. So it's best to ask them and then try to translate this into your framework. And then there could be the first assessment of cutoff criteria. So in terms of detail and what you are able to collect on data, there are some cutoff rules according to different standards. Second step is data collection. So it could be helping to prioritize product categories. So your biggest turnover products or biggest volume products, and try to get the most accurate data for these products first. Then, of course, again, internal and external communication. So you have to engage with colleagues at all levels. You have to engage with suppliers, with different suppliers, and trying to get the emission factors for your raw materials so you are able to calculate in the next step. And then you will be connecting the emission data for your raw materials with your models and processes to calculate your product carbon footprint. And then the third step, data sharing. So similar to the corporate carbon footprint, it will be coming in handy to have a clear structure for an internal database for your results. And then you can be thinking about verification systems. Do you want a third party to look at your models and processes? And then, of course, what kind of reporting standard will you be using? Any private initiative or an ISO standard? Again, there are lots of opportunities which can be challenging at times also. And there are also external databases where you might want to publish your data and make it accessible to your customers. And after you've done this, every 2, 3, up to 4 to 5 years, I recommend 2 to 3 years, you should be checking your models if there had been any changes in your processes or if you have better data for your raw materials. So it starts again from the beginning. But this is a very fast and quick guide, both for corporate level emissions and for product level emissions. Thank you very much for listening. And we are your partner for sustainability, of course.